Clara Whitmore pressed both hands flat against the wooden counter to keep herself from shaking. She had already counted her coins twice. She already knew the answer, but she asked anyway because she had nothing left but the asking. "Please," she said. "Just enough flour to last the week." Harlan Mercer looked her up and down, the way a man looks at something he finds amusing rather than human. Then he turned to the room full of customers, spread his arms wide and laughed. "Boys, looks like the widow wants charity again." If this story already has your heart pounding, you are exactly who this channel was made for. Please subscribe right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in, because what happens next in Red Hollow will stay with you long after the last word. Clara had walked 3 miles in the August heat to reach that store. 3 miles through red dust and ruthless sun, wearing the same dress she had worn to her husband's burial 7 months ago, because it was the only garment she owned that still held its shape. The fabric pulled tight across her hips in ways that made her self-conscious every single day. But she had learned to carry herself anyway. Chin up, eyes forward, the way her mother had taught her before the world got its hands on both of them. She had spent the morning doing the arithmetic 6 different ways, hoping one calculation might come out different from the rest. It never did. After paying the last installment on the debt Thomas had left behind, a debt she had known nothing about until the bank's man came knocking 2 weeks after the funeral, she had 43 cents left to her name. 43 cents, a farmhouse with a roof that leaked in 4 separate places, and a coming winter that the old-timers were already calling the worst in a decade. She needed flour. She needed salt. She needed lamp oil and a small amount of dried beans. She had worked out exactly how long those supplies could stretch if she was careful, and careful was the only way she knew how to live anymore. What she could not have worked out, what no amount of arithmetic could have prepared her for, was Harlan Mercer. The general store was the only real commerce in Red Hollow. Harlan Mercer had built it, owned it, and ran it with the particular satisfaction of a man who understood that when you controlled what people needed, you controlled the people themselves. He was not a large man physically, but he had learned early that power is less about size and more about who's watching. He always made sure someone was watching. On the morning Clara pushed open that door, the store held 7 people. 3 men from the Dawson spread waiting on a feed order. 2 women from the church auxiliary examining yard goods in the corner. Old Pete Halverson, dozing on the bench by the window, the way he did most mornings. And a young cowhand Clara didn't recognize, leaning against the far wall, picking his teeth and looking at nothing in particular. 8 people, counting Harlan himself behind the counter. 8 witnesses. Clara knew the moment she stepped inside that the space felt different from what she remembered. She had not been in Mercer's store since before Thomas died. In those days, she had come in on her husband's arm, or sent him alone, and nobody had looked at her the way they looked at her now. The way they looked at her now was the way people look at something they've already decided about. She walked to the counter anyway. "Mr. Mercer," she said, keeping her voice level. "Good morning." Harlan looked up from his ledger with the slow, theatrical deliberateness of a man who wants you to know he was doing something more important before you arrived. "Morning," he said. Just the one word, flat as a stone. "I was hoping to speak with you about a small amount of credit," Clara said. "Just until I can bring in some earnings. I've been taking in mending work, and Mrs. Alcott has promised me 3 days of kitchen help next week, so I expect—" "Credit," Harlan said. "Yes, sir, just for some basics. Flour, salt, beans, and lamp oil. I've written down exactly what I need." She reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, which she set on the counter and smoothed with 2 fingers. Her hands, she noticed, were not quite steady. She pressed them flat to stop the trembling. Harlan looked at the paper the way he had looked at her, with an assessing expression that had nothing to do with the numbers written there. "You know what I tell folks who come in here asking for credit. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sure you have a policy," Clara said. "I understand that. I'm just asking if there's any flexibility given the circumstances." "The circumstances," Harlan repeated. He leaned back from the counter and raised his voice just enough, just the precise amount to ensure that everyone else in the room could now hear him clearly. You mean the circumstances of being a widow woman who can't seem to manage what her husband left her? The church women in the corner looked up from their yard goods. The men from the Dawson spread shifted their weight and glanced at each other. Clara felt the heat rise up her neck and into her face. I'm managing as best I can. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for credit, which is a business arrangement, and I intend to pay every cent. My concern. Harland said, his voice now carrying the easy warmth of a man who is genuinely enjoying himself, is whether I'm making a sound business decision. He let his eyes move over her with deliberate slowness, head to toe. To the way you appraise an animal at auction. A woman in your condition, living alone out there, no husband, no income to speak of. How exactly do you expect to settle a debt? I told you, mending work, kitchen help. I have skills. Skills. He said the word like it tasted amusing. Well now. He turned to look at the room, an actor checking his audience. She's got skills, boys. One of the Dawson men snorted. It was small, that sound. Almost nothing. But Clara heard it the way you hear a knife scrape across tin. The sound went straight through her and kept going. I would appreciate, she said quietly, if you would simply answer the question. Can you extend credit or not? Here's what I'll tell you. Harland placed both palms on the counter and leaned forward with the comfortable authority of a man on his own ground. I don't extend credit to folks who can't demonstrate they're worth the risk. Now, a woman your size. He paused, and Clara saw the exact moment he chose to say. The next thing, saw him decide it with full awareness of what it would do. A woman carrying all that weight, living alone on a failing property, that doesn't strike me as a good risk, Mrs. Whitmore. That strikes me as somebody who's already a burden on this community and looking to become more of one. The church women said nothing. Old Pete appeared to be studying the floorboards. The young cowhand by the wall had stopped picking his teeth. Clara stood completely still. She had spent 7 months learning how to absorb cruelty without flinching, because flinching gave people satisfaction, and she had decided long ago that she would not be anyone's satisfaction. She breathed through her nose, slow and even, and she looked at Harland Mercer with eyes that gave him nothing. I see, she said. Now if you want to prove you're worth helping. Harland continued warming to his performance because that was what it was now. A performance, and the room was his stage, and Clara Whitmore was his prop. Maybe you'd like to entertain us a little. Give us a song maybe, or a little dance. Show us what skills you've got. He grinned at the Dawson men. What do you boys say? Think the widow ought to earn her flower? The laughter that followed was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was the quiet, shared laughter of people who know they're doing something they shouldn't and are doing it anyway. The kind of laughter that passes from face to face, like a contagion, infecting even the ones who knew better, pulling them in with the social gravity of cruelty dressed up as fun. Clara felt her jaw tighten. She felt her eyes burn. She was absolutely not going to cry. She had made herself that promise months ago, and she had kept it through worse moments than this one, though right now she would have been hard-pressed to name what those worse moments were. She picked her piece of paper up off the counter. She folded it back along the original crease. She tucked it into her coat pocket. Good day, Mr. Mercer, she said, her voice perfectly level, which cost her more than anyone in that room would ever know. She turned toward the door. She was 4 steps away from it when it opened. The man who walked in had to duck slightly to clear the frame. He was tall in the way that some men are tall, not just in measurement, but in presence, the kind of tall that reorganizes a room simply by entering it. He wore a plain work coat over a dark shirt, trail-worn boots, and a hat that had seen serious weather. His face was lean and weathered, and still in the way of a man who has learned that most things don't require a reaction. Clara had never spoken to Wyatt Callahan. She knew of him the way everyone in Red Hollow knew of him, the solitary rancher beyond the western hills, the one who came to town only when necessary and left again without conversation. People said different things about him. People who didn't know him said he was cold, strange, unfriendly. People who had observed him longer, more carefully, said something different. They said he was a man who paid attention, who noticed things others missed, who said exactly what he meant and nothing extra. He stopped just inside the doorway. His eyes moved across the room with the unhurried assessment of someone cataloging a situation before deciding what to do about it. He saw the Dawson men. He saw Harland behind the counter. He saw the expression on Harland's face, that still fading amusement, and the quality of the silence that had followed whatever just happened. And he saw Clara. She was standing 4 steps from the door, with her hands in her coat pockets, and her chin lifted, and her eyes bright with something she was working very hard not to show. Wyatt looked at Harland. "What's the trouble?" he said. His voice was quiet. Not soft quiet. There's a difference. Soft is a thing without edges. Wyatt Callahan's voice had edges. It just didn't use them unless it needed to. Harland spread his hands in a gesture of easy innocence. "No trouble. Just having a little conversation with the widow here about credit terms. Nothing that concerns you, Callahan." "Concerns me now," Wyatt said. He stepped further into the store and set his hat on the counter. Not aggressively, just deliberately, the way you set something down when you intend to be somewhere for a while. "What does she need?" Clara turned. "Mr. Callahan, you don't have to—" "What does she need?" he said again, and this time he was looking at Harland when he said it, and the question had shifted into something else entirely. Harland's smile had not disappeared, but it had changed texture. "Now look, Callahan, this is a business matter between me and Mrs. Whitmore, and I'd appreciate if you'd—" "Flower," Clara said, because she had made up her mind in the space of 3 seconds that Wyatt Callahan was not a man who wasted time, and wasting his time would be an insult to whatever he was offering. Salt, dried beans, lamp oil, those are the basics. Wyatt looked at her for a moment. Something passed across his face. Not pity, which she'd had enough of to last several lifetimes, but recognition. The kind of look that passes between two people who understand the same particular flavor of difficulty. "Anything else?" he asked. That's enough. But Mr. Callahan, truly, I can't allow you to—" He had already turned back to Harland. "Fill the order," he said. "I'll cover it." "Now hold on," Harland said, and his voice had developed a new edge, the edge of a man who feels his authority slipping and doesn't like the sensation. "I run this store on my terms, Callahan. I decide who gets service and when. You can't just walk in here and—" "I can pay," Wyatt said. "That's generally how a store works. Man pays man gets goods. You have some other arrangement in mind." The silence in the room had changed quality entirely. It had moved from the easy, complicit silence of people watching someone get humiliated to the tighter, uncomfortable silence of people watching the balance of power shift in a direction they didn't predict. Harland looked around the room. The Dawson men were suddenly very interested in the feed schedule tacked to the wall. The church women had gone back to their yard goods with great concentration. Old Pete was either asleep or doing a convincing impression of it. "Fine," Harland said tightly. "Fine, I'll fill the order." Clara watched him move to the shelves with the tight, controlled irritation of a man who has been publicly outmaneuvered and knows it. She watched him pull down a sack of flour, measure out salt and beans, pull a tin of lamp oil from the back shelf. She looked at Wyatt, who had turned to lean against the counter with his arms crossed facing the room, not watching Harland, but simply present in a way that made his presence felt. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "No," he agreed. "I don't want your charity. I want you to know that." He looked at her then, and she held the look because she meant what she said, and she wanted him to understand that. "It's not charity," he said. "Charity is when you give something to make yourself feel better. This is a business transaction." He nodded toward Harland's back. "He had goods. I had money. We did business." "He wasn't going to give me those goods." "No," Wyatt said. "He wasn't." His jaw shifted slightly. "I heard what he said to you." The heat came back up her neck, but she kept her face still. "People say things." "They do," he said. "Doesn't mean they should." Harland set the bundled supplies on the counter. His movements were sharp and economical, every gesture communicating his displeasure. He named a price. Wyatt paid it without negotiation, which seemed to irritate Harland further. There was no satisfaction to be had in a man who wouldn't argue. Clara reached for the bundle. It was heavier than she'd expected. Harland had packed it in a wooden crate, which she realized now she was going to have some difficulty carrying 3 miles in the August heat. She adjusted her grip and said nothing about this. "Where's your wagon?" Wyatt asked. "I walked." He looked at the crate. He looked at her. He did not say anything condescending or offer a comment on the difficulty of carrying a wooden crate 3 miles in summer heat, for which she was grateful, because she had been on the receiving end of too many comments that were disguised as concern. "I've got a buckboard out front," he said. "I'll take you home." "Mr. Callahan, it's on the way," he said, which they both knew was not necessarily true, since nobody lived out beyond the western hills by accident, and Red Hollow sat squarely in the opposite direction. But he said it simply and without drama, and she found she didn't have the energy to argue with simple. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He picked up the crate with one hand and held the door open with the other, and Clara walked out of Mercer's store into the flat August sunlight with her supplies and her dignity, both of which she had very nearly lost. She heard Harland's voice behind her as the door was swinging shut. "Don't let her make a fool of you, Callahan," he called. "That woman's nothing but trouble and wait. You'll see." The door closed. Wyatt set the crate in the buckboard and untied his horse from the post. He did not respond to what Harland had said. He did not appear to feel the need to. "He talks a lot," Clara said, climbing up to the bench with more grace than the situation might have predicted. "Men who talk that much," Wyatt said, settling beside her and taking up the reins, "are usually afraid of something. Just takes time to figure out what." He turned the buckboard toward the edge of town, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. She had grown so accustomed to silence being full of things people weren't saying. Judgment, pity, impatience, that she had forgotten. Silence could simply be silence. "Your place is off the Miller Road," he asked eventually. 2 miles past the fork. The farmhouse with the..." She paused. "You'll know it when you see it." "The roof," he said. She looked at him. "You know the property. I know most properties in the county. I like to know what's around me." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. "How long has it been like that?" "Since spring. There was a storm in April that took part of the eastern side. I've patched what I can reach." "What about the winter?" She looked ahead at the road. The summer heat rolled off the packed earth in waves. "I'll manage." I didn't say anything to that, and she was grateful. She was deeply tired of people either telling her she couldn't manage or telling her she absolutely could manage, with the hollow encouragement of people who would not be there when the managing got difficult. They reached the fork in the road, and he turned without asking. Past the fork, the road narrowed between stands of scrub brush, and the landscape opened up into the kind of wide, flat beauty that was easy to miss if you were too absorbed in your troubles. Clara had spent so many months being absorbed in her troubles that she had stopped seeing it. Now, sitting next to a man who said little and seemed to mean everything he did say, she looked at the land and felt something loosen very slightly in her chest. "Thomas, my husband, he always said this was the prettiest stretch of road in the county," she said. She hadn't meant to say it. It came out on its own. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "When did you lose him?" 7 months ago. Ranch accident." She paused. "He was fixing the fence on the south pasture. Horse came through where it shouldn't have. The doctor said it was fast." She stopped. "I don't know if that's true or if doctors say that because it's kinder." "Probably both," Wyatt said. She looked at him. Something in the straightforwardness of the answer reached her in a place she hadn't expected. "Both," she repeated quietly. "Yes, that's probably right." The farmhouse came into view around a long curve, and Clara felt the familiar shame of seeing it through someone else's eyes. It was not an ugly house. It had been a good house once, with solid bones and a deep porch and a kitchen that caught the morning light in a way that had made her happy when she first arrived there as a new bride. But 7 months of neglect, of deferred repairs and unpaid maintenance, and one woman trying to manage what 2 people had barely kept up, had left their marks. The roof on the eastern side sagged visibly. 2 porch boards were broken through. The fence along the front had lost several posts and listed sideways like a row of tired soldiers, Wyatt stopped the buckboard and looked at the house for a long moment without speaking. "I know," Clara said. "It's structurally sound," he said, which was not what she expected him to say. "The main walls are good. The foundation looks solid. The roof on the east side needs to come off and get redone before winter, but that's work, not catastrophe." She turned to look at him. "You can tell all that from here. I've built and repaired a fair amount of structures in my time." He climbed down from the buckboard and lifted the crate from the bed without being asked. "The porch boards are a problem. They're a safety issue, not just cosmetic. Those need to be addressed first." "Mr. Callahan." "Wyatt," he said. She paused. "Wyatt, I appreciate you bringing me home. I do. But I can see you looking at that house with the expression of a man who is about to offer to fix things. And I need you to understand that I have been accepting help from people in this town for 7 months, and I know what it costs. There is always a cost. People help, and then they hold it over you, or they decide that because they helped you once, they now have opinions about your choices, or they help you, and then I'm not offering to fix your house," Wyatt said. He set the crate on the porch on a solid board. She noticed he had tested it first with his boot, before setting anything on it, and straightened up. "I'm telling you, it's fixable, because you looked like a woman who might benefit from knowing the problem is finite." Clara stopped. She looked at him standing on her porch with her groceries. This man she had never spoken to before today. This man who had walked into a store full of laughing people and replaced their laughter with silence by doing nothing more dramatic than paying for her flour. "That is," she said carefully, "a very specific kind of thing to say." "I'm a specific kind of man," he said. He descended the porch steps and moved back toward the buckboard. "I'll be coming back through this road on Thursday. I'll bring lumber." "I didn't ask for lumber." "No," he said, untying the horse. "You didn't." He swung up into the seat and gathered the reins and looked at her from under the brim of his weathered hat. "You asked for flour. I'm doing that thing where I see a problem that's fixable, and I make a decision about it. You realize you can't just make decisions about other people's problems." "I realize that," he said. He turned the horse. "Clara." She blinked. He had used her name. Not Mrs. Whitmore, the way everyone in Red Hollow used it carefully with that particular distance the town had assigned to her since Thomas died, but Clara. Simple and direct, like everything else he did. "What?" she said. "That roof is going to fail before January. That is not a fixable problem once winter sets in. It becomes a disaster." He looked at her steadily. "I'll bring lumber on Thursday. You can decide what to do with it." He clicked to the horse and the buckboard rolled away down the narrow road, and Clara stood on her broken porch with her flour and her salt and her lamp oil, and a strange new feeling she hadn't experienced in so long that it took her several minutes to identify it. Not hope exactly. She had learned to be careful with hope. But something adjacent to hope. Something that felt like the possibility of hope, held at a careful distance, examined from all sides before being allowed any closer. She picked up her crate and carried it inside. Thursday, she thought. She would see about Thursday. He came on Thursday. He came with lumber and tools, and a younger man from his ranch. A quiet, capable hand named Ellis, who moved with the efficient economy of someone who had been working hard since before he could reason about it. They arrived before 8 in the morning, before the worst of the heat, and they began on the porch boards without preamble or ceremony, pulling the rotted wood and replacing it with clean pine that smelled like the inside of a forest. Clara brought them coffee and stood in the doorway and watched and told herself she felt uncomfortable about this, which she did, but she also felt something else beneath the discomfort, something that was trying to work its way to the surface. "The east roof slope is worse than I thought from the road," Wyatt said around mid-morning, coming down from the ladder to take a cup of coffee from her. "There's water damage in the framing underneath. It'll need more than a patch." "How much more?" he told her. She did the math in her head and felt the familiar cold weight of numbers that didn't come out right. "I don't have that." "I know," he said. "I do." "Wyatt." "It's not charity," he said, and looked at her with those steady dark eyes, and she remembered that he had said that before. "I heard what he said to you." She thought about what kind of man hears something like that and decides it matters. Why? She asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. Why does it matter to you? You don't know me. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, I knew someone once who needed help, and nobody offered it. I made myself a promise about that. He looked at the house, not at her. It's not about knowing you, it's about what's right. She studied the side of his face while he looked at the house. The weathering around his eyes. The particular stillness of a man who had grieved something and decided to keep living anyway. That's very simple, she said. Most true things are. They worked until mid-afternoon. Ellis on the roof, and Wyatt moving between the porch and the side wall, where a section of siding had rotted through, and Clara found herself working alongside them without anyone suggesting she should, pulling nails from reclaimed boards and sorting hardware and fetching whatever was needed. Slipping into the rhythm of the work, the way she had always slipped into the rhythm of whatever needed doing. By the time they loaded the tools back into the buckboard, the porch was solid. The worst of the siding was replaced, and the east roof slope was braced against further collapse until proper repairs could be completed. You work hard, Ellis said to her as he climbed into the buckboard, and he said it with the frank directness of someone who rarely bothers with compliments but means them when they come. I always have, Clara said. He nodded as if that confirmed something. Wyatt stood by the horse for a moment. There's more to do, he said. I know. I'll come back next Thursday. She looked at him. You have a ranch to run, Wyatt. You have your own work. I do, he said. I'll come next Thursday. She stood on her new porch boards and watched the buckboard roll away down the road and felt the particular quality of being cared for by someone who did it quietly, without announcement, without the expectation of gratitude. And she thought about how long it had been since anyone had done that, and she did not entirely trust the feeling yet, but she did not turn away from it either. She went inside and began supper and thought about Thursday. 2 weeks later, when the east roof repair had progressed to the point of needing another full day of work, Wyatt found the thing she had been hoping he wouldn't find. The ledger. She had left it on the kitchen table because she'd been working on it that morning, and she hadn't anticipated him coming into the kitchen, and by the time she thought to put it away, he was already standing over it with the look of a man who is very good at reading numbers. These are store accounts, he said. Yes. She set a coffee cup down on the table without looking at him. I've been keeping track of what I've spent versus what I've brought in. These are not your accounts, he said. He looked at her. These are other people's accounts. This is Dawson's grain account. This is, he turned a page. This is Mercer's own merchant ledger. She was quiet. Clara. His voice was not accusatory. It was careful in the way he was always careful, like a man walking in unfamiliar terrain, testing each step. Where did you get these figures? She sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table. When I was working at the bank before Thomas died, I did bookkeeping for Mr. Aldridge 2 mornings a week. I noticed some inconsistencies in the way certain accounts were being recorded. I kept notes because I thought I was misreading the ledger format, but I wasn't misreading it. Wyatt sat down slowly. His eyes moved back to the papers. She watched him work through the numbers the way she had worked through them, following the trail she had laid out with 5 months of careful attention and cross-referencing. Mercer has been double billing, he said. It wasn't a question. On grain accounts, feed accounts, and at least 3 land transactions that I can identify. The discrepancies are small enough individually that nobody would catch them without looking at the full picture across multiple ledgers. But I had access to multiple ledgers and She paused. I looked. Wyatt set the papers down. He looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't quite name, something that was several things at once, some of which she hadn't seen directed at her in a very long time. You've been sitting on this for 5 months, he said. I've been trying to determine if I was certain. I am certain now. Does anyone else know? No. He was quiet for a long moment. You know what this means if you bring it forward. I know. Mercer has friends in this county, the kind of friends who have long memories about people who caused trouble for them. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. And you still intend to do it? Yes, she said simply. Because the truth of it was simple. People had been cheated. She had the evidence. She was the only one who currently had both the evidence and the knowledge to present it clearly. The discomfort of what would follow was real, but it was not complicated. Wyatt was quiet for so long that she began to worry she had misjudged him entirely, that the man who had walked into Mercer's store and set money on a counter was not after all the man sitting across from her now. Then he said, "You'll need someone who can speak to the county magistrate. I know the man. He's honest." She blinked. "You believe me?" "Why wouldn't I?" Because she stopped herself. Because most people would think a woman in my situation, a widow with nothing, might be constructing a grievance. She didn't say this out loud. He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he had heard it anyway. "You're careful," he said. "I've watched you work for 2 weeks. You don't do anything without thinking it through 3 times first. If you say these numbers are wrong, the numbers are wrong." She felt something close in her throat that she had to work to keep from showing. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday." He agreed, but he was not talking about the roof anymore. The Thursday Wyatt had promised for the magistrate did not come as quickly as either of them had anticipated. It came 12 days later on a Wednesday, because the county magistrate, a deliberate man named Judge Elias Croft, was not a person you approached on a schedule someone else set. You approached him when the evidence was complete, when the case was airtight, when every number had been checked against every other number until there was no room left for doubt. Wyatt had told her this plainly, and Clara had agreed, and so she had spent those 12 days going back through the ledger pages with a focus that left her eyes burning by lamplight every night. She found 4 more discrepancies she had initially dismissed as clerical error. They were not clerical error. By the time Wyatt came for her on that Wednesday morning, she had a package of papers that represented 18 months of Harlan Mercer systematically skimming from every significant transaction that passed through his store and his associated land dealings. The amounts varied. Some were as small as $3 on a grain order. Some were as large as $200 on a land transfer. Individually, they were the kind of mistake a man could explain away at a dinner table. Together, they were something else entirely. "Are you ready?" Wyatt asked from the porch. "I've been ready for 5 months, Clara said, and picked up the papers. Judge Elias Croft occupied a small office above the assay house on Red Hollow's Main Street, a location that placed him usefully above the daily commerce of the town without being separate from it. He was a compact, gray-haired man with the kind of face that had long since settled into permanent skepticism, not because he was unkind, but because his work required him to view every claim through the lens of what people wished were true, rather than what actually was. He looked at Clara, the way he looked at everyone who walked into his office, with measured, unhurried assessment. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Judge Croft." She sat down across from his desk and placed the papers in front of him. "I'll explain as you read if that helps." It took 2 hours. Croft was not a fast reader. He was a thorough one, which was more valuable. He stopped her 3 times to ask clarifying questions. His questions were specific and technical, which told her he understood numbers, which was what she needed him to understand. When she answered exactly, and without embellishment, because embellishment was what people used when the facts weren't sufficient, and in this case the facts were entirely sufficient. Wyatt sat in the chair to her left and said almost nothing. He had a quality she was learning to recognize: the ability to be present without crowding. He was there if she needed him, and absent if she didn't, and she found the distinction more remarkable the more she observed it. When the 2 hours were finished, Croft set down the last page and looked at her over the papers. "This is thorough work," he said. "Thank you. I don't say that lightly. I've seen men twice your experience present half this clearly." He tapped one page. "This cross-referencing between the feed accounts and the land transfer records, that's what makes this airtight. Without that connection, a good lawyer could have argued coincidental discrepancy." "I know," Clara said. "That's why I waited until I had it." Croft looked at Wyatt. "How long have you known about this?" 12 days, Wyatt said. "You didn't tell anyone." "It wasn't my information to tell." The judge nodded slowly. He looked back at Clara. You understand what happens when I open a formal inquiry. Mercer will know. He has people in this county who will make things difficult for anyone involved in bringing a case against him." "I understand," Clara said. "You're not afraid of that." She thought about standing at Harlan Mercer's counter with 43 cents in her pocket while a room full of people laughed. She thought about the walk home in the August heat with nothing but what Wyatt's money had bought her. She thought about 7 months of closed doors and turned backs and the particular cruelty of a small town that had decided what she was worth and kept deciding it every day, every time she walked down the street. "Judge Croft," she said, "I have been afraid of considerably worse things than Harlan Mercer." Something shifted in the judge's permanent skepticism. It didn't disappear. It reorganized itself around something that might in a different light have been respect. "All right," he said. He squared the papers. "I'll begin the formal process this afternoon." They walked out of the assay house into the flat midday light, and Clara realized her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the release of something she had been holding tightly for 5 months, and the body's need to express that release somehow. Wyatt noticed. He didn't comment on it. He simply slowed his pace to match hers, and said nothing until she had worked the shaking out. "That went well," she said eventually. "It did," he agreed. "He's going to be furious when he finds out." "Yes. And his friends in the county." "Will be a problem," Wyatt said. "A manageable one." She looked at him. "You say that like you've managed problems before." "I have," he said simply. She wanted to ask what kind of problems. She wanted to ask about the person he had mentioned, the one who needed help, and nobody offered it. She wanted to ask a great many things about Wyatt Callahan that she had been carefully not asking, because she understood on some level that asking too directly was not the way into the parts of a man like him that mattered. So instead she said, "Thank you for coming with me today." "You didn't need me there," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I was glad you were." He looked at her, and she held the look, and something passed between them in that midday light that neither of them had a name for yet, and she suspected neither of them would try to name it for quite some time, and she found she was fine with that. She had been in enough of a hurry in her life, and it had not served her particularly well. The word spread through Red Hollow within 48 hours of Croft's inquiry being formally opened. This was faster than Clara had expected. She had expected a week, perhaps 2, for the information to filter through the particular social channels of a small frontier town. She had underestimated how few secrets Harlan Mercer actually kept, despite his reputation for discretion, and she had underestimated how many people in Red Hollow had been quietly watching his accounts, with the uneasy feeling that something wasn't adding up. When it became known that a formal fraud inquiry had been opened against Mercer's accounts, and that it had been brought by Clara Whitmore, the widow, the one he had mocked in his own store, the town did what small towns always do when presented with information that requires them to reconsider their existing positions. It divided. On one side were the people who had benefited from Mercer's goodwill, or believed they had, or feared what would happen to that goodwill if the inquiry succeeded. These were the people who began making comments in the feed store and at the post office about grieving widows with grudges and the dangers of a woman with too much time and not enough sense interfering in business affairs she couldn't understand. Clara heard these comments secondhand because nobody made them to her face. They came through Dorothea Webb, who was one of the churchwomen from the day at Mercer's store, and who had been finding reasons to visit Clara's farmhouse with increasing frequency since the Thursday of the porch repair, bringing preserves and dried fruit and information in roughly equal measure. "They're saying you fabricated the records," Dorothea told her, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and the expression of someone delivering bad news she finds morally outrageous. "That you made up the discrepancies to get revenge for what he said to you in the store." "I know," Clara said. "It's not true." "No, it isn't." "Can you prove it isn't?" "Judge Croft can prove it isn't. That's rather the point of having a judge involved." Dorothea was quiet for a moment. "He has a lot of friends, Clara. More than you might expect. Men who depend on his store for their operating credit, men who've done business with him on land deals. If they pressure Croft..." "Croft isn't the kind of man who bends under pressure," Clara said. "I could tell that in the first 10 minutes. You could tell that in 10 minutes. I'm good at reading people, Clara said. It's a skill you develop when you're the kind of person other people look through rather than at. Dorothea was quiet again, and Clara could see her processing, that could see the slight flinch, that was acknowledgement of something Dorothea hadn't fully examined about herself before now. I didn't say anything, Dorothea said quietly. That day in the store. I should have. Yes, Clara said without cruelty, because she had found that the truth was most useful when it was delivered without cruelty. You should have. I'm sorry. I know you are. Clara refilled her coffee cup. You can stop being sorry and start being useful if you'd prefer. There are 3 other women in the church auxiliary who were in that store that day, and at least 2 of them have husbands who have been overcharged on their grain accounts. If they were to speak to Judge Croft voluntarily with their own documentation, Dorothea sat up straighter. You want witnesses. I want people who have their own reasons to tell the truth, Clara said. That's different from witnesses. Witnesses are people you put in front of a judge. People with their own reasons are people who show up because they want to. The speed at which Dorothea Webb left the farmhouse that afternoon told Clara everything she needed to know about how useful Dorothea Webb was capable of being when properly directed. It was that same evening, 2 days after the inquiry opened, that Harlan Mercer came to Wyatt Callahan's ranch. Clara was there because she had been there since mid-afternoon, going over the supplementary documentation Croft had requested with Wyatt at the kitchen table. She heard the horse before she heard the knock, and she saw Wyatt's expression shift in a way that suggested he had heard it too, and had already decided something about it. Stay here, he said. I will not, she said. He looked at her for half a second, reassessing, then gave a single short nod and went to the door. Harlan Mercer stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and his expression arranged into something that was attempting contrition and achieving calculation instead. He was not alone. There was a man Clara didn't recognize, standing 2 steps behind him, broad-shouldered and expressionless, whose presence was clearly intended to communicate something. Callahan, Harlan said. I was hoping we could talk. We're talking, Wyatt said. Harlan's eyes moved past Wyatt's shoulder and found Clara, and something moved through his expression too fast for her to name. I see you have company. What do you want, Harlan? Wyatt said, not moving from the doorway. I want to discuss this situation that's developed. This inquiry. Harlan's voice had the careful modulation of a man who has rehearsed this conversation several times and is running it now with adjustments for live conditions. I think there's been a misunderstanding, and I think if reasonable people sit down together, the time for sitting down together was before you billed the Dawson Ranch $212 over cost on their winter grain order, Wyatt said. Or before you took $60 off the top of the Halverson land transfer in recording fees that you collected and never passed to the county office. Or before. He glanced back at Clara, who gave him a single nod. Before you ran a markup scheme on 7 separate credit accounts going back 18 months. Harlan's carefully arranged expression cracked along its edges. Now you listen here, Callahan. Those are accusations. A woman with a grudge digging through records she has no business touching, and you standing behind her. She had every business touching those records, Wyatt said. She was employed at the bank. She was doing her job. The fact that her job revealed yours is not her problem. It's yours. I am offering, Harlan said, and his voice had dropped to something lower and more deliberate, to settle this quietly. Restitution to the affected accounts. No further inquiry. Everyone goes home, and this doesn't become a county matter. Clara stepped forward until she was at Wyatt's shoulder. Mr. Mercer, she said. Harlan looked at her with an expression that made no effort to conceal its contempt. The county matter, Clara continued, has already begun. Judge Croft opened it 2 days ago. That is not something you can settle quietly anymore, because it is no longer between you and me. She looked at him steadily. It is between you and the county, and the county has 18 months of documented evidence that I have personally verified across 6 separate ledger sources. You think that gives you power, Harlan said. A woman nobody in this town took seriously 6 weeks ago. You have no idea what I can bring down on you, on your situation, on, His eyes cut to Wyatt. On people who have chosen to involve themselves. The broad-shouldered man on the porch shifted his weight slightly forward. Wyatt stepped outside the door and pulled it mostly closed behind him. He was not a man who made theatrical gestures, but the act of stepping fully out onto his own porch, into his own space, with the easy self-possession of a man who has no concern whatsoever about what the next 60 seconds might require of him, that was not nothing. "I want you to think carefully," Wyatt said to the broad-shouldered man, "about what you're being paid and whether it's worth what comes next." Something in the man's face suggested he was in fact thinking about exactly that. "Get off my property," Wyatt said to Harland. His voice had not risen. It had done the opposite. It had gone very quiet with the particular quality of a sound that comes from somewhere deep and certain. "Get off my property, Harland, and don't come back. Whatever you have left to say it in front of Judge Croft." Harland put his hat back on his head with the sharp-clipped movement of a man who is furious and has decided that the most powerful thing he can do right now is leave on his own terms. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Wyatt agreed. "It isn't. That's rather the problem for you." The two men rode away down the ranch road in the thickening dusk, and Clara stood at the window and watched them until they disappeared around the tree line. "He's going to do something," she said. "Yes," Wyatt said. He had come back inside and was standing by the table looking at the papers. "He's a man who's been comfortable for a long time. Comfortable men get desperate when the comfort is threatened." "What kind of something?" "Nothing that changes the math," Wyatt said. "The math is what it is. You've built something that doesn't fall down when someone pushes it." He looked at her. "He knows that. That's what's making him desperate." Clara sat down. The day had been long, and the visit from Harland had drawn something out of her that left her feeling hollowed in a way she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't fear. She had identified fear in herself enough times to know its texture, and this was different. This was the particular exhaustion of being right in a situation where being right came with real cost. "When Thomas was alive," she said, and then stopped, surprised at herself for starting. Wyatt waited. "When Thomas was alive, I never had to think about being right or wrong in public. I had opinions. I was competent. But it was all private, between us. When he died, it was like suddenly being on a stage. I never asked to stand on, and everyone in the audience had already decided how the play was going to go." "And now," Wyatt said. "Now," she said slowly, "I'm not sure I care how they think the play goes." She looked at him. "Is that strange?" "No," he said. "That's what happens when you stop auditioning." She looked at him across the table with the papers between them, and thought about what it meant that she understood exactly what he meant by that. No explanation required. No clarification needed. She had simply heard it and known it was true. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The person you mentioned, the one who needed help and nobody offered. How was still for a moment, not guarded, just still." "My sister," he said. She waited. She came to Red Hollow 10 years ago with her husband. He was not a good man. The town knew it, people knew it, and nobody said anything because he was useful to them. He ran the freighting operation, and men who need their freight moved tend to keep quiet about the man moving it. His jaw shifted. "She asked for help twice. I wasn't here yet, I came after. But she asked 2 people I know of, and both of them told her she ought to go home and work it out." "What happened to her?" Clara asked. "She left," he said. "Eventually. She's in Denver now. She's all right." He paused. "She's all right, but the time between asking for help and getting out was 2 years. 2 years she spent because people decided she wasn't worth the trouble of speaking up." Clara held that for a moment. She held the weight of it, and the particular quality of the way he'd said 2 years. Not with anger, though the anger was there underneath, but with the grief of a man who has gone over those 2 years many times and never found a way to change them. "That's why you walked in," she said. "That day in the store. I've walked past a lot of stores," he said. "A lot of situations where I could have said something and didn't. Because it wasn't my business, or because the timing wasn't right, or because—" He stopped. "I walked past one too many of them." She understood. She understood in the way you understand something that has also been true of yourself, the recognition that comes not from sympathy, but from proximity. "Wyatt," she said. He looked at her. "What you did that day, it wasn't a small thing. I know it felt like a small thing. I know from the outside paying for someone's flower looks like a simple act." She paused. "It was the first time in 7 months that someone treated me like I was worth treating well. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of thing a person carries." I was quiet for a long time. The lamp on the table put warm light between them, and outside the window the western hills had gone from gold to dark, and somewhere across the range, a coyote made its comment on the evening and fell silent again. "You deserve to be treated well," he said finally. "That is not a complicated statement." "It shouldn't be," she said. And yet, he agreed. They worked for another hour after that, going over the additional documentation Croft had requested, and the conversation had shifted into something quieter and more settled. The way a fire shifts after the initial burn and finds its steadier, longer heat. Clara noticed, as she had been noticing for weeks now, the way Wyatt moved around her. Not around her, the way people moved around something fragile, but around her, the way people move around something they have begun to trust as real. He handed her papers without looking to see if she needed them explained. He disagreed with her organization of one section of the documentation and said so directly, and when she showed him why she'd organized it that way, he looked at the pages again and said, "You're right, it's clearer your way," without any of the complicated performance that men so often made of conceding a point to a woman. She did not know what to do with Wyatt Callahan. She did not know yet what he meant or what she meant to him. And she was wise enough by now to understand that pressing for definitions before they were ready was how you broke things that needed time to set properly. She knew that she trusted him, which was not a small thing, given her recent history of trust. She knew that his presence had stopped feeling like an imposition, that somewhere in the past weeks it had shifted into something that felt more like the right kind of company. She knew that when she thought about what came next, the inquiry, the town's reaction, whatever Harlan Mercer was planning in the particular darkness of a cornered man. She thought about it with Wyatt somewhere in the picture. Not as a solution, not as a rescue, but as a fact. As someone who was going to be there. She was not sure she had earned the right to think that yet. She was not sure she cared whether she had earned it. The following week moved with the particular speed of a situation that has been set in motion and cannot be stopped. Croft's inquiry formally summoned 4 of the affected businesses. 2 of them came forward with additional documentation that had been sitting in their own files unexamined because nobody had given them a reason to examine it until now. Dorothea Webb arrived at the courthouse on Tuesday morning with her husband, who had the expression of a man who has recently discovered that his grain bills have been wrong for 18 months and is experiencing several emotions simultaneously. And through all of it, the town watched. The town watched the way it always watched things. It had gotten wrong with the uneasy, sidelong attention of people trying to recalibrate without admitting they need to recalibrate. Clara walked down the main street of Red Hollow on Thursday morning, and people who had looked through her for 7 months now looked at her with the complicated expressions of people who are reassessing. Some of them said nothing. Some of them said good morning with the slightly over-deliberate warmth of people trying to signal a change without using the words. Old Pete Halverson stopped her outside the post office. He was a man of few words on his best days, and what he said was not elaborate. He took off his hat and held it and said, "My wife always liked you, Mrs. Whitmore. I should have listened to my wife sooner." It was 8 words. Clara felt them settle somewhere deep and said, "Thank you, Pete," and meant it fully. She was coming out of the feed store where she now had a credit account that the new clerk had set up without comment when she encountered the Dawson brothers. All 3 of them, which meant a conference had been convened somewhere, and a decision made, because the Dawson brothers only moved as a unit when they had reached consensus. The eldest, Cal Dawson, was a man of 50 with sun-baked skin and the particular directness of someone who has spent his life working land that doesn't tolerate sentimentality. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Dawson," she said. "You found the grain account billing." "I did." He nodded. Slowly. The way you nod when you are measuring whether the weight of what you're about to say is appropriate to the occasion. We've been running that account for 11 years. 11 years we trusted the man's numbers. He stopped. You found it in 5 months. I had the full picture, she said. You only had your own piece. Still, his jaw set. We owe you. I want you to know we know that. You don't owe me, she said. But if you mean what you're saying, Judge Croft will be glad of your formal testimony. Cal Dawson looked at his brothers. His brothers looked at him. Some silent communication passed between them that had the quality of a conversation that had already been had somewhere earlier and was now being confirmed. We'll be there Monday morning, Cal said. Clara nodded. Monday morning, she said. She walked back toward the buckboard. Wyatt's buckboard, which he had lent her for the day's errands with the same unceremonious practicality with which he did everything, and she permitted herself very briefly something that was not quite a smile, but was close to one. The particular private expression of a woman who has been told for 7 months what she was worth and is watching the accounting change. When she reached the buckboard and climbed up and took the reins and sat for a moment before turning the horse, she thought about what Wyatt had said the morning after Harlan's visit to the ranch. Nothing that changes the math. The math was changing all right, but it was changing in the direction she had built it to change. She turned the horse toward the ranch road and let him set his own pace, and the August sun was high and hard and beautiful in the way of things that don't apologize for what they are. And Clara Whitmore, widow of Red Hollow, bookkeeper and cook and mender, and careful keeper of records, drove through it with her hands steady on the reins and her face turned toward what was coming. The Monday morning that the Dawson brothers walked into Judge Croft's courthouse was the same morning Harlan Mercer filed a counter-complaint. Clara found out about it the way she found out about most things in Red Hollow now, through Dorothea Webb, who arrived at the ranch before 7 with flour she didn't need to borrow and information she couldn't wait to deliver. He's claiming you stole the ledger records, Dorothea said before she had fully cleared the doorway. He's saying you took copies of private business documents during your employment at the bank without authorization, and that the entire case is built on evidence obtained illegally. Clara set down her coffee cup. That's not true. I know it's not true. Does Judge Croft know it's not true? Mr. Aldridge authorized my access to every record I worked with. I never touched anything outside my assigned accounts. She paused. The cross-referencing I did matching Mercer's store ledger against the bank records, I did that from memory. I didn't take anything. Dorothea sat down heavily. Can you prove that? Mr. Aldridge can prove it. He kept a log of every document pulled from the bank files. My name appears only on the accounts I was assigned. She was already moving toward the back room where she kept her own records. Mercer knows this. He's not trying to win that argument. He's trying to delay. Delay what? The formal testimony. Monday was supposed to be the Dawson brothers' formal statements. If Croft has to spend the morning dealing with a counter-complaint that gets pushed. Every day it gets pushed is another day Mercer has to work on the people who haven't testified yet. She found what she was looking for, a letter dated 8 months ago from Mr. Aldridge, confirming her employment terms and access privileges. She had kept it for no reason she could have named at the time. She was grateful now for the particular instinct that made her keep things. I need to get to the courthouse. I'll drive you, Dorothea said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. Dorothea stood up and retied her bonnet with the decisive movements of a woman who has recently discovered that she prefers action to guilt. I've been not having to do things for 7 months. I find I'm tired of it. They were in Dorothea's wagon and 3 miles down the road when they met Wyatt coming the other direction. He pulled his horse up alongside the wagon and looked at Clara's face and said, "He filed a counter-complaint." "Yes," she said. "How did you know?" "Ellis heard it from the blacksmith this morning. It went through town fast." He turned the horse to fall in alongside the wagon. "Croft will dismiss it. The authorization records at the bank are clear." "I know, but it costs time." "Everything costs time," Wyatt said. "The question is whether Mercer has more of it than you do." She looked at him. "Does he?" "No," Wyatt said with a certainty that was not bravado. It was the particular certainty of a man who has looked at a situation from all sides and arrived at a conclusion he trusts. He's got more money and more connections and more years of people doing what he wanted. But you have the truth, and truth doesn't get tired. She held that for exactly the 3 seconds she allowed herself, before she turned back to the road and the courthouse that was coming into view at the end of it. Judge Croft was not a man who appreciated having his Monday morning complicated, and his expression. When Clara walked in, followed by Dorothea, and then by Wyatt, who appeared in the doorway a moment later with Ellis behind him, communicated this with precision. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I expect you've heard. I brought the authorization letter from Mr. Aldridge," she said, and set it on his desk. "And Mr. Aldridge himself is available to testify to my access privileges if you need him. I can have him here within the hour." Croft looked at the letter. He looked at it for 45 seconds. She counted with the focused attention of a man who is determining whether it says what he's been told it says. "The Dawson brothers are waiting outside," he said. "I know. Mercer's attorney arrived before you did." "I assumed he would." Croft set the letter down and looked at her over the top of it, with the reorganized skepticism that had been gradually shifting across their interactions into something more like regard. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to ask you something directly, and I need a direct answer." "All right. Is there anything in how this evidence was gathered that gives me reason to pause? Anything at all, however small, that a good attorney could use to complicate my process?" Clara thought about it. She gave it the full consideration it deserved. Not the quick denial of someone protecting themselves, but the careful review of someone who has been honest long enough to know when honesty costs something and pays it anyway. "No," she said, "there is not." Croft picked up the letter. "Then we proceed." He looked at Wyatt. "Callahan, you're here as what exactly?" "As someone who will stand in this doorway for as long as necessary," Wyatt said, "and make sure this process runs without interruption." Croft considered this. "That's not a legal designation." "No, sir," Wyatt agreed. "It isn't." Something moved through the judge's expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. "Wait outside," he said. Mercer's attorney was a man named Gideon Park, imported from the county seat, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how seriously Mercer was taking this. Park was smooth in the way of men who have made their careers saying difficult things pleasantly. He had the bearing of someone who had never lost an argument in a room where he controlled the vocabulary. He did not control the vocabulary this morning, because the Dawson brothers came in, and Cal Dawson put 11 years of receipts on Judge Croft's table with the particular solemnity of a man settling a debt, and the numbers on those receipts matched Clara's documentation with the exactness of a key meeting a lock. There was no argument about methodology when the evidence came from the man who had been paying the bills. There was no argument about motivation when three brothers spoke in the same flat factual voice about the same flat factual overcharges. Park tried twice to introduce procedural objections, and Croft dismissed both of them with the economy of someone who has run out of patience for a specific kind of distraction. Clara sat in the corner of Croft's office and watched it happen, and felt something shift in the room, the specific shift that happens when a narrative that has been maintained by social pressure and repeated assertion meets actual documentation, and the documentation wins. Park knew it too. She could see it in the subtle reorganization of his posture, the way a man settles when he realizes the ground under him is different from what he was told. After the Dawson brothers left, and Park had gathered his papers with the precise controlled movements of a man who will present a different face once he's outside this room, Croft looked at Clara. "He'll try something else," the judge said. "Yes," she said. "I expect he will try several things." "Are you prepared for that?" She thought about 7 months of survival. She thought about 43 cents and 3 miles of August dust and a store full of laughing people. She thought about a ledger she had kept in secret for 5 months, because she needed to be certain before she moved, and about Wyatt Callahan walking into a room and changing its temperature simply by paying attention. "Judge Croft," she said, "I have been preparing for this my entire adult life without knowing I was doing it. What Mercer tried next came 4 days later, and it did not come through legal channels. It came through Wyatt's ranch. Clara was in the kitchen mid-morning when she heard Ellis shouting from the direction of the south pasture, and she was out the door and moving before she had consciously decided to move, because she had learned in the months since Thomas died that the kind of shouting that comes without warning is never about something small. She found Ellis at the fence line of the south pasture with his hat in his hands and an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not fear, which would have been simpler, but the particular tight-jawed anger of someone looking at deliberate destruction. 40 feet of the south fence had been cut clean through. Not broken cut. With wire cutters methodically in the particular dark of last night when nobody was watching. I've got eyes on 7 of them already. They didn't go far. The other 4... He stopped. The other 4 are Wyatt's best breeding stock. Clara stood at the cut fence and looked at the clean, deliberate edges of the wire, and felt a cold, clear anger work its way through her that had nothing shaking in it at all. This was not the complex, difficult anger of public humiliation. That anger had texture and heat and required management. This was simpler. This was the anger of looking at something that was done specifically to hurt a man who had done nothing except stand on the right side of a dispute and understanding exactly who had done it and why. "Where is Wyatt?" she asked. "Took 3 hands to the north boundary this morning. Survey work. He doesn't know yet." "Don't send for him yet," Clara said. "Get the 7 horses secured first. Do you know which direction the other 4 went?" Ellis looked at her with the slight adjustment of expression that she had learned meant he was recalibrating, reassigning her in his mental accounting from guest to something else. "Northeast, I think. There's a draw about 2 miles out where they tend to drift when they get loose." "Then that's where we start," she said. "I can ride." "Mrs. Whitmore." "I can ride Ellis," she said. "Thomas had horses. I've been riding since I was 9 years old. Get me a horse." They found 3 of the 4 missing horses in the draw exactly where Ellis had predicted. The 4th took another hour and a half and required riding out further than Clara's legs were entirely prepared for after months of limited riding, but she did not mention this because it was not relevant. What was relevant was that by the time they came back through the ranch gate with all 11 horses recovered and the cut fence temporarily patched with wire from the supply shed, she had made several decisions about what came next. Wyatt arrived back from the north boundary at midday. Ellis met him before he reached the barn and told him quickly and quietly, and Clara watched from the porch as Wyatt took the information in, watched his face go through several things rapidly, each of them controlled by a man who had long practice in not letting his interior weather show on his exterior and then become very still. He came to the porch. "You helped recover the horses," he said. "Ellis and I found them. The 4 went to the northeast draw." "Are they all right?" "All of them. The breeding stock didn't go far. They're back in the south pasture. Fence is patched temporarily. It'll need proper repair, but it'll hold until morning." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face that she was still learning to read the particular quality of Wyatt Callahan's gratitude, which was nothing like most people's gratitude. Most people's gratitude came with words, with elaboration, with the need to verbalize the feeling until it felt fully expressed. Wyatt's came with a stillness, a settling, a kind of directed attention that was more complete than language. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "He's escalating. This wasn't a random act and we both know it." "No," Wyatt said. "It wasn't. This means the legal process is working. A man doesn't cut fences in the night because he's confident. He does it because he's afraid." She looked at him. "I need you to hear that because what I'm about to suggest is going to sound like I'm pushing this further and faster than you might be comfortable with." Wyatt sat down on the porch step. He looked out at the ranch with the expression of a man taking a full accounting of what he has and what he is willing to risk. "Tell me what you're thinking." "I want to take everything to Croft, not just the financial fraud, the fence." She paused. "And I want to do it tomorrow, not next week." "That's a pattern of criminal conduct charge," Wyatt said. "Fraud plus intimidation of witnesses." "Yes." "That's a much larger case than what we walked in with." "Yes," she said again. "But it's the true size of the case. It was always this size. We were just presenting one piece of it." She looked at him directly. "He's showing us he'll keep going. Every day we wait is a day he has to do more damage." The fence was a message, Wyatt. My answer to that message is to make the case so complete that there is no version of this story where he walks out of it looking like anything other than what he is. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. Ellis, he said without turning around. Ellis appeared from around the corner of the house with the prompt efficiency of a man who had been within hearing distance and was not pretending otherwise. Yeah. You saw the fence cut this morning. Can you describe exactly what you saw in specific enough terms that a judge would have no doubt about whether it was accidental or deliberate? It was deliberate, Ellis said flatly. The cuts were made in a pattern. 6 cuts evenly spaced across 40 feet of fence, each one made at the same height, same angle. That's not an animal, that's not weather, and that's not an accident. A man did that. A man with wire cutters and enough time to be careful about it. Wyatt looked at Clara. All right, he said. Tomorrow. They arrived at Croft's office the following morning at 8, and by the time Gideon Park learned that the case had expanded and arrived to object, the expansion had already been formally entered into the record, and there was nothing for him to object to, except the fact of it, which was not an objectable fact. Croft looked at the documentation of the fence, Ellis's written account, the measurements Clara had taken of the cut points, the assessment of the ranch hand, who did the temporary repair. And he looked at it with an expression that had entirely departed from skepticism and arrived somewhere in the vicinity of controlled fury, which on a judge's face was a different and more useful thing. This is intimidation of a property holder in an active legal matter, he said. Yes, Clara said. You can establish the connection between this incident and Mercer's ongoing case. The timing establishes it. The pattern of the cuts establishes deliberate human action. And Mercer's own visit to the Callahan ranch 4 days before the incident, during which he made explicit statements about consequences for involvement in the case, establishes motive and intent. She set the final page in front of him. I've written it out in the order you'd want to present it. Croft looked at the page. He looked at it the way he had looked at the original documentation, with total thorough attention. Then he set it down and looked at Clara in the way she had come to understand meant he was about to say something that mattered. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I've been a county judge for 19 years. I want to tell you something. She waited. In 19 years, I have seen cases built by lawyers with 40 years of experience that were less clearly constructed than what you have put in front of me over the past 3 weeks. He paused. That is not a compliment I give lightly. Clara felt the words land and held them carefully the way you hold something that matters without squeezing it too hard. Thank you, Judge. I am going to issue a formal summons to Harlan Mercer for next Thursday, Croft said. Not an inquiry, a summons. He will appear before me and answer to both the fraud charges and the intimidation charge, and he will do it in a public session, because I think the people of this county have the right to hear this matter resolved in front of them. Public session. The words moved through Clara like something physical. She had not asked for a public session. She had not thought to ask for it. But sitting in that office with Wyatt quiet and solid to her left, and Croft's 19 years of frustrated justice finally finding its appropriate outlet, she understood Wyatt was right. The people who had laughed in that store, the people who had looked through her, the people who had said she had no skills, no worth, no future that anyone ought to concern themselves with. They were going to hear this. They were going to hear all of it, in the days between Croft's announcement of the public session and the session itself. Red Hollow did what Red Hollow did, best it talked. The talking was different now from the talking of 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, the talking had been the comfortable talk of people who believed they knew the outcome. Now it was the uncertain recalibrating talk of people who were not sure anymore, and uncertainty makes people say things with more care than comfort does. Clara walked through town on Wednesday, the day before the session, and people who had never spoken to her spoke to her. Some of them said things that were clearly the product of guilt, renegotiating itself into something more presentable. Some of them said things that were simple and genuine and cost them something to say. She received all of it with the same even-measured acknowledgement, not warm, not cold. She was not here to make people feel forgiven before they had done the work of actually changing. Harlan Mercer she did not see on Wednesday. She heard he was in his store conducting business with the tight, compressed energy of a man conserving everything for a specific moment. She heard through Dorothea that Park had been in his back room for 2 hours that morning. She heard through Cal Dawson's youngest brother, who had no particular talent for keeping information to himself, that 2 of Mercer's closest business associates had quietly declined his invitation to a supper the previous evening, citing prior engagements that nobody believed existed. People were recalculating. That was what it looked like when the center of a corrupt arrangement started to give not a dramatic collapse, but a series of small individual recalculations. Each person separately deciding that the cost of loyalty to a losing position was higher than the cost of simply not being there when it fell. Clara came back to the ranch that evening and found Wyatt at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee already poured, as if he had known exactly when she would arrive, which she was beginning to understand was simply what Wyatt Callahan did. He paid attention and made adjustments and never made a performance of either. "Tomorrow," she said, sitting down. "Tomorrow," he said. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "I want to tell you something before tomorrow. Because after tomorrow, things will be different. And I don't know exactly how. And I want to say this while the shape of things is still what it's been." He looked at her. He gave her the full quality of his attention, which was a different thing from simply looking. It was the thing that had marked him from the first day, the willingness to be entirely present with what was happening without managing it into something more comfortable. "You changed something," she said. "When you walked into that store. I know you think it was a small thing. I know that in your accounting of yourself, it probably sits as just one day's decision about what was right. But I need you to know from me directly that it was not a small thing for the person it happened to. I had started to believe them. That's the part nobody talks about when people tell you long enough that you're not worth much. There's a part of you that starts to do the arithmetic their way. You walked in, and you did a simple thing, and it stopped that arithmetic cold." She looked at him steadily. "I am not the same woman who was standing at that counter. I don't know entirely yet who the different woman is, but I know the difference started with you." Wyatt was quiet for long enough that the lamp between them had time to flutter in a draft from somewhere and settle back to steady. "You did the work," he said. "I bought flour." "You bought flour," she agreed. "And you came back on Thursday, and you believed me about the ledger before you had any reason to. And you sat in a judge's office and held the door and let me do what I needed to do without trying to do it for me." She paused. "That is not just buying flour, Wyatt. That's a whole way of being with a person. Most people don't know how to do that." Something shifted in his face, not broke open, because Wyatt Callahan was not a man who broke open, but shifted, the way a door shifts on well-maintained hinges, smooth and without resistance. "I know how it feels," he said quietly, "to be in a room where nobody sees you right. I know the specific kind of alone that is." He looked at her. "I didn't want to be one more person who walked past it." She held that. She held it, the way she held all the things he said that arrived without embellishment, and therefore landed with their full weight. "Thank you," she said, "for not walking past it." They sat with their coffee and the night sounds of the ranch coming in through the window, and the quiet between them that had nothing empty in it, and Clara thought about tomorrow, and about the woman she was going to walk into that courthouse as, and about who was going to be walking beside her when she did. Thursday came in bright and hard, the way August mornings did in that country, with the kind of light that left no shadow unpunished and no pretense standing. Clara dressed carefully and deliberately because she had learned over the past weeks that the body knows what the mind is doing and can be instructed toward certainty through the rituals of preparation, and she wanted every part of herself pointed in the same direction when she walked through that courthouse door. Wyatt was waiting outside with the buckboard. Ellis was there too, and Dorothea Webb, who had brought her husband and her sister, and the Dawson brothers, who arrived in their own wagon with a solemnity that felt like a decision rather than an obligation. They formed a small procession down the main street of Red Hollow on a Thursday morning, and people on the street stopped to watch them pass, and Clara looked straight ahead and kept her hands loose on her lap and her back straight. The courthouse was full. She had not expected it to be that full. Every seat was taken, and people were standing along the walls, and the low expectant murmur of a crowd that has come to see something settle fell quiet as she walked in. She felt the weight of every eye in the room, and she walked through it the way she had walked through everything in the past months, one step at a time forward without apology. Harlan Mercer was already seated at the front beside Gideon Park, who had the expression of a man who has been handed a losing case by a client who refused to acknowledge it was losing. Harlan himself looked at Clara when she entered, and for the first time since the day in the store, she held his gaze and waited for him to look away first. He looked away first. She sat down. Wyatt took the seat beside her. The room settled into something that was not quite silence. Too much breath in it, too much attention, but was close enough. Judge Croft came in, and the room stood and sat, and Croft looked over his courtroom with the 19-year expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific kind of morning and recognized it when it arrived. This session is called in the matter of the formal fraud complaint against Harlan Mercer Merchant Red Hollow, he said, and in the related matter of a criminal intimidation charge arising from an incident of property destruction against the Callahan Ranch, which this court has connected to the principal matter. He looked at Park. Counsel for the defendant will refrain from procedural objections that have already been reviewed and denied in chambers. We are here to hear facts. We will hear them. Park opened his mouth and closed it again. Croft called Clara first. She stood up and walked to the front of the room and turned to face it. The full room, all the faces she had been seen by and unseen by and misread by and disregarded by, and she began to speak. She spoke for 40 minutes. She spoke clearly and exactly and without drama, because the drama was already in the numbers and the numbers did not need her to embellish them. She walked the room through 18 months of deliberate methodical theft from the people sitting in those seats, the grain overcharges, the land transfer skims, the credit account markups. She held up the documentation page by page, and Croft entered each into the record, and the murmur that had been present when she started grew quieter and then quieter still, and then became the particular held-breath silence of a room full of people understanding something at the same time. When she was done, Park stood up to question her. He was good at his work, she would grant him that. He was precise and persistent, and he found every possible angle of pressure. He questioned her methodology. He questioned her access. He questioned her motivation. She answered every question the same way she had built the case, exactly, without embellishment, without defensiveness, with the calm of a woman who has checked her work enough times to be certain of it. When Park was finished, he sat down, and the room was quiet, and Clara walked back to her seat. Wyatt's hand found hers under the edge of the table. Not a dramatic gesture, not a declaration, just his hand over hers, brief and certain, for exactly the 3 seconds it took for her to take a breath and let it out and come back fully to herself. Then Cal Dawson stood up to testify. And after him Ellis. And after Ellis, Mr. Aldridge from the bank, who had the authorization records in a leather folder and read them with the slow, deliberate authority of a man who has been waiting for someone to ask him the right question. And Gideon Park, for all his craft and experience and the considerable fees Harlan Mercer was paying him, had nothing left to do with his hands but hold his pen and not write anything with it. It was when Aldridge was finishing his testimony that the door at the back of the courtroom opened, and a woman Clara had never seen came in and asked to speak to Judge Croft. She was perhaps 60, weathered and straight-backed, and she had the particular quality of someone who has traveled a distance to be somewhere and is not interested in small talk about the journey. Croft looked at her. "Ma'am, this is an active session. My name is Helen Voss," she said. "I ran the hotel in Cotter Creek for 12 years, and I have documentation of 4 land transactions involving Harlan Mercer and a deceased partner that I believe this court will find relevant." The silence in the room changed quality entirely. It went from the held breath of people following a known story to something rawer, the silence of a room realizing the story was larger than they knew. Clara turned to look at Wyatt, who was looking at the woman named Helen Voss with an expression that told Clara he had not known this was coming. Either that this was the case, expanding beyond even what she had built, finding its own new edges in the open air of a public session. Harlan Mercer had gone very still. Gideon Park leaned toward his client and said something in a low, rapid voice that Clara couldn't hear, and whatever it was, Harlan's answer was a short, sharp shake of his head that communicated several things at once. None of the confidence of a man who believed he was winning. Croft looked at Helen Voss for a long moment. He looked at the room. He looked at his record, and then at the folder in the woman's hands. "Ma'am," he said, "please take a seat. We will hear from you after the current witness completes his testimony." Clara faced forward and breathed. There was more. There was more that she hadn't known about, more that had been waiting somewhere beyond the edges of what she had found. And it was here now in this room, in the hands of a woman who had driven from Catter Creek, because truth, when it is finally given the right conditions, does not stay where you leave it. It grows. It finds its own level. And in Red Hollow on a Thursday morning in August, in a courthouse full of people who had spent months deciding what a heavyset widow was worth, it was finding its level now. Helen Voss sat down in the front row, with her leather folder on her lap and her hands folded over it, and she waited with the patience of someone who has waited a long time already, and has learned that the last stretch of waiting is the one that matters most. Aldridge finished his testimony. Park declined to question him, which told Clara everything she needed to know about where Park believed the case now stood. When a lawyer stops asking questions, it is not because he has run out of questions. It is because he has calculated that every answer will make things worse. Croft called Helen Voss forward. She walked to the front of the room without hurry, set her folder on the edge of Croft's table, rather than holding it, and turned to face the room, the way Clara had turned to face it squarely without apology, with the specific posture of a woman who has made peace with the cost of saying what she came to say. "Tell this court who you are and why you're here," Croft said. "My name is Helen Voss," she said. "I owned and operated the Voss Hotel in Catter Creek for 14 years and 12. I misspoke at the door. 14 years. 8 years ago, Harlan Mercer and a business partner named Roy Stills approached me about purchasing an adjacent property. I owned a lot on the east side of Main Street in Catter Creek that I'd been holding since my husband died." She opened her folder and removed the first page without looking down at it, which told Clara she had reviewed these documents enough times to know exactly what was on each one. "They told me the lot was assessed at $400. I had no reason to disbelieve them. I sold it for $400. She held the page out to Croft. The actual county assessment at the time of sale was $940. I found this out 3 years later when the property changed hands again, and the new sale price was published in the county record. The room did not erupt. Rooms full of people who have already been absorbing difficult information for 2 hours do not erupt at one more piece of it. They go quieter. The specific quiet of people doing arithmetic they don't like the answer to. "Roy Stills," Croft said. "Where is he now?" "Dead," Helen Voss said. 2 years ago. Heart gave out." She paused. Convenient timing, some might say. Park stood up. "Objection to characterization." "Sustained," Croft said without looking at Park. "Mrs. Voss, please confine yourself to documented facts." "Of course." She produced a second page. "Documented fact: Roy Stills and Harlan Mercer sold the Catter Creek lot 14 months after purchasing it from me for $900. Documented fact: the profit from that transaction never appeared in any business record I've been able to locate for either man. Documented fact." She produced a third page. "There are 2 additional property transactions in Catter Creek, and 1 in Fuller's Mill that follow the same pattern, same method, different victims." Harlan Mercer had been still for so long that Clara had begun to watch him the way you watch a structure for signs of how it intends to fall. He was a man who had spent 20 years being the most powerful person in every room he entered, and the experience of watching that power drain away through the floor of a courthouse. He had always assumed was a place other people got their problems addressed. That experience was doing something to him. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. The way his hands had moved from the table to his lap where they couldn't be seen. Gideon Park was writing rapidly. Clara suspected he was writing a letter of resignation in his head. When Helen Voss finished, she picked up her folder and walked back to her seat with the same unhurried dignity she'd arrived with, and Clara thought not for the first time about what it cost women to do this. To gather documentation over years, to hold it to wait for the right room and the right moment, to then stand up in front of a crowd and be exact. When every instinct formed by a lifetime of being told to be accommodating, said to soften it. Apologize for it, present it with enough modesty that no one could accuse you of overreach. Helen Voss had not softened it. Neither had she. And Croft, to his credit, had not asked either of them to. "Mr. Park," Croft said, "does your client wish to make a statement before I adjourn to consider the full record?" Park stood. He and Mercer had a brief, low conversation that the room couldn't hear, but could read the particular body language of a lawyer telling a client that the options have narrowed to one. Mercer shook his head twice. Park said something else. Mercer shook his head once more, and then seemed to deflate slightly, not dramatically, not the way it happened in stories, but the small internal collapse of a man who has just accepted something he'd been refusing to accept for weeks. Park faced the court. "My client has no statement at this time." Clara exhaled. Wyatt's hand found hers again under the table. This time, he didn't let go. Croft closed the session with the quiet formal authority of a man who understood that what had just happened in his courtroom was larger than the paperwork it would generate. He announced that his formal findings would be issued within 10 days, that Mercer's properties and accounts were frozen pending those findings, and that anyone with additional documentation relevant to the case had 7 days to present it to his office. Then he looked out over the room at the faces of people who had come to witness something and were leaving, having witnessed considerably more than they expected, and he said one more thing. "This court recognizes the work of Clara Whitmore, whose documentation made this proceeding possible. The county owes her a debt that the formal record will reflect." The room was quiet for a moment. Then, Cal Dawson started clapping. It was not a theatrical gesture. It was a rancher's applause, solid and deliberate. The kind that means something because it comes from a man who doesn't offer it lightly. His brothers joined him. Ellis joined them. Dorothea Webb was already crying, which she would later describe as a reaction to dust. Clara sat very still and let it happen around her, and the feeling in her chest was not triumph. Triumph was too loud for what it was. It was something quieter. Something more like the specific relief of a weight you've carried so long, you stopped noticing it, and the moment it lifts, you feel the absence before you feel anything else. Outside the courthouse. In the bright August afternoon, the town of Red Hollow regrouped around itself. Clara stood on the steps with Wyatt beside her and watched the people file out and reconfigure into the various conversations that always follow a public reckoning. The small groups, the low voices, the glances in her direction that carried different things than glances had carried 2 months ago. Harland Mercer came out of the courthouse with Park 3 steps behind him, and he stopped when he reached the bottom of the steps and found Clara standing there. They looked at each other. He was not a small man even now. He still had the physical authority that money and years of deference had built into his bearing. But it was different the way a large structure is different after you've seen the damage in its foundation. Still standing. Not the same. "I hope you're satisfied," he said. His voice was controlled. Not gracious controlled, which was different, and she respected that he didn't attempt grace he didn't have. "I'm not satisfied," Clara said. "Satisfied would mean it never happened. It happened. The people in that room lost money because of what you did, and that's not a thing that gets undone just because it gets acknowledged." She looked at him steadily. "But it gets acknowledged. That part matters." He looked at her for another moment, and something moved through his face that was complex enough that she didn't try to name it, and then he walked away, and she let him walk. Wyatt said nothing. She hadn't needed him to. The weeks that followed had their own particular texture, not the high drama of the courthouse, but the quieter, more durable drama of things being set right. Croft's formal findings came in 8 days rather than 10, which Clara suspected was deliberate. A judge who had been angry for 2 hours and wanted the record settled before the anger cooled. The findings were comprehensive. Mercer was ordered to make full restitution to every documented overcharge case, plus interest at the county rate. The land fraud cases, because they crossed county lines, were referred to the state for additional proceedings. A formal criminal charge was filed for the fence cutting, which Park negotiated down to a fine and a formal letter of acknowledgement that would enter the public record. The fine was not large enough in Clara's opinion. She said this to Wyatt. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. But the public record is permanent," she said, working through it the way she worked through any equation. A man who wants to do business in this county will have that letter available to read. That's not nothing. It's not nothing, Wyatt said. And the restitution payments will come through Croft's office, not through Mercer's discretion. He can't decide who gets paid and who doesn't. He can't, Wyatt said. She looked at him across the kitchen table. You're letting me talk myself into being at peace with an imperfect outcome. You're good at it, he said. Doesn't need much help from me. She felt the corner of her mouth move. That might be the most Wyatt Callahan thing you've ever said. He looked at her with the expression she had learned to wait for, the one that started in his eyes before it reached the rest of his face. The slow gathering of something that was entirely his own particular version of warmth. I'll take that. The Dawson brothers' restitution check was the first to be issued by Croft's office, and Cal Dawson brought it to Clara personally, which was not required and therefore meant something. He stood on her porch, her solid, properly repaired porch, with his hat in his hands and said, I'd like to hire you. She looked at him. For what? Bookkeeping, the ranch accounts. He was not a man who elaborated unless pressed, so she waited. We've been doing our own records for 11 years. Clearly that arrangement has some gaps in it. I'd like someone who knows what she's doing to look at the whole picture twice a year. He paused. I'd pay a fair wage. I'd put it in writing. And I'd tell every rancher in my association that I've hired you if you want the word to get around. Clara looked at Cal Dawson on her porch with his hat in his hands and thought about the morning 7 months ago when she had walked 3 miles in August heat to ask Harlan Mercer for 43 cents worth of credit. She thought about the arithmetic that hadn't come out right, no matter how many times she ran it. I want the word to get around, she said. Yes, I'll do it. Cal nodded, put his hat back on, turned to go, and then turned back. My wife said to tell you she always knew you were more than they gave you credit for. He paused. I should have listened to her earlier too. Seems to be a theme. After he left, Clara sat on the porch step and held the conversation in her mind and thought about what it meant to have your worth located, not in anyone's opinion, but in your own demonstrated capacity, set clearly in the record of what you had actually done. She thought about the difference between being believed and being proven, and how for a long time she had wanted the first and learned to work toward the second, and how the second, when it arrived, felt more solid under her feet. The referrals came. Not all at once in a frontier town trust, moved at the speed of observation, not at the speed of talk, but they came. Within 3 weeks of Cal Dawson's visit, Clara had 4 bookkeeping clients. Within 5 weeks, she had 7. She set her rates carefully exactly at the level the work warranted, and not below which she had been warned by every instinct formed by years of undervaluing herself to undercut, and she did not undercut them, and nobody objected. She managed the accounts from her farmhouse, which was by then fully repaired, east roof properly redone siding, replaced new fence posts along the front. The kitchen window reframed, so it caught the morning light, the way it had when she first arrived there as a new bride. Wyatt had done most of the substantial work himself with Ellis on Thursdays, until the Thursdays had accumulated into something that looked less like a repair project and more like a habit. A good habit. The kind you stop examining and simply live. How was there most evenings now? Not always. He had a ranch to run, and running it was a full life in its own right, but more often than not. He came for supper and stayed to talk, and the talking had evolved over the weeks, from the careful, deliberate exchange of 2 people measuring each other into something easier, more honest. The kind of conversation that happens when 2 people have stopped performing for each other and started simply being together. She cooked because she liked it, not because she felt she owed it. He ate because it was good, and because something in him recognized that being fed by someone who cooked with actual attention was a thing worth receiving. These were not complicated negotiations. They were simply 2 people learning the specific grammar of each other's company. It was on a Tuesday evening, not a Thursday, not a significant day, by any external measure, that he said what he said. They had finished supper, and she was at the table with the Dawson accounts spread in front of her, making a final notation before putting them away. And he was sitting across from her with a cup of coffee, and the particular quality of stillness that meant he was thinking about something he hadn't decided yet whether to say. She finished her notation, closed the ledger, looked at him. "What?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I want you to come to the ranch." "I'm often at the ranch," she said. "Not to visit," he said. "To stay." She went still. "I've been thinking about how to say this in a way that doesn't sound like I'm asking you because of what you need or what I feel sorry about or any other reason that isn't the actual reason," he said. "I haven't found a better way than just saying the actual reason." "Which is," she said. Her voice was even. She had gotten very good at keeping her voice even. "You are the best person I've spent time with in years," he said. "You are honest and exact, and you don't stop when things get difficult, and you see straight through to what matters in a situation without needing it explained." He looked at her with the full, steady attention that was simply who he was. "I want that beside me. Not as a guest. Not as someone I'm helping out. As someone who's there because she chose it, and I chose it, and we've both thought about it long enough to mean it." The lamp on the table put its warm light between them. Outside, a nightbird made its comment on the dark and went quiet. Clara looked at Wyatt Callahan. This man who had walked into a store and changed the temperature of her life by doing a simple, decent thing, and then kept doing simple, decent things consistently without announcement, because that was the kind of man he was, and she thought about all the reasons to be careful. She thought about them thoroughly and honestly, the way she did everything, and then she set them in their proper order of importance, and she discovered that the actual reason, the one he had said, was larger than all the reasons to be careful. "I want to ask you something first," she said. "Ask it. If I come to the ranch, if I choose that I keep the bookkeeping work, I keep my clients, I keep the work that is mine." "Of course," he said with the slight expression of a man who is not sure why this required clarification, but understands why she needed to say it. "And the farmhouse," she said. "I'm not selling the farmhouse." "I didn't ask you to." "I know you didn't. I'm telling you what's true." She paused. "Thomas built that house. It is not a perfect house, and it was not always a perfectly happy house, but it is mine, and the fact that I'm choosing to be somewhere else doesn't change what it is." "All right," Wyatt said. "All right," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. He nodded once the way. He nodded when something had been decided, not with relief, because relief implied he had doubted the outcome. And Wyatt Callahan was not a man who presented doubt he didn't have, but with the settling quality of a man who has stated something true and had it met with something equally true. "There's something else," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "My sister. She's coming from Denver in October. I told her about you in my last letter." He paused. "I told her quite a bit about you." Clara felt warmth move through her chest at the particular significance of that. A private man writing letters about someone choosing to include her in correspondence with the person who mattered most to him. "What did you tell her?" "That you were the most competent and stubborn and clear-eyed person I'd encountered in 10 years, he said, "and that I was grateful she'd come to Red Hollow." She looked at him. "Grateful she'd come. Your sister came to Red Hollow." "No," he said. "Grateful you'd come." A pause. "That you walked into Mercer's store that morning, and I happened to be there." She thought about that morning. 43 cents. 3 miles of August heat. A room full of people laughing. "I wasn't grateful at the time," she said. "No," he said. "I don't imagine you were." "I'm grateful now," she said quietly. "So am I," he said. The restitution payments moved through the county over the following weeks with the methodical progress of a legal process that has been properly constructed and cannot be stalled. The Dawsons received their full amount. The Halverson estate, old Pete's son handling it since Pete himself regarded money matters with the same drowsy indifference with which he regarded most things, received theirs. 7 other families received corrected accounts, and the difference in cash handled through Croft's office, documented and signed, entered into the permanent record of Red Hollow County. Clara processed several of these transactions herself because some of the affected families had become her clients, and being trusted with the full picture of someone's financial life was something she still felt the particular weight of and intended to keep feeling, because the day it stopped feeling like responsibility was the day she ought to stop doing it. She moved to the ranch on a Saturday in early September, which felt right, not a day that anyone would mark as significant, not a public declaration, just a practical act, completed on a practical day. She brought 3 boxes and a trunk and the ledger she'd been keeping since before Thomas died, and Ellis helped her carry them inside without ceremony, and then disappeared back to the barn, which she appreciated. Wyatt showed her where to put things. The farmhouse 8 miles away sat empty, but maintained. She went back twice a week to check it, and she intended to keep doing so indefinitely. It was hers. That fact did not require explanation or defense. It simply was. Dorothea Webb came to visit the ranch the 2nd week of September and declared the kitchen excellent and the view from the east window perfectly acceptable, and Wyatt Callahan better than she'd given him credit for, though she delivered this assessment to Clara in the kitchen, rather than to Wyatt's face, which was characteristic of Dorothea. "People are talking about you differently," Dorothea said with her coffee cup and her particular ability to deliver information as if it were simply weather. "In town. The way they say your name." "How do they say it?" Clara asked, not because she needed to know, but because Dorothea had driven out here specifically to tell her, and it would be unkind not to receive it. "Like you're someone," Dorothea said simply. "Not someone's widow, not the woman from the store, someone." She paused. "I know that's late in coming. I know it should have been true all along." "Yes," Clara said. "It should have." "I'm sorry it wasn't." "I know," Clara said. "Keep being useful. That's better than sorry." Dorothea nodded with the expression of someone who has been given a fair and useful instruction. "There's a woman out on the Fetter Road. A widow came in last spring. She's been having trouble getting the feed store to extend her credit. Harlan's gone, but some of the habits he built are still running without him." She looked at Clara carefully. "I thought you might know what to say to her." Clara held her coffee cup. She thought about 3 miles of August heat. She thought about a wooden counter and 43 cents. She thought about the specific invisible arithmetic of a woman who has started doing her accounts by other people's numbers and needs someone to show her the calculation is wrong. "Send her to me," Clara said. "I'll talk to her." Dorothea nodded. She set her cup down. She put her bonnet on. And she left with the efficiency of a woman who has completed what she came to do and has 2 more stops before supper. Clara stood at the window and watched her go, and then turned back to the ranch kitchen. Her kitchen now, or at least the kitchen she had chosen, which was close enough to the same thing, and began clearing the cups. Wyatt appeared in the doorway from the yard, hat in hand, dust from the afternoon's work still on him. He looked at her in the way he had looked at her since the beginning, with the full, unhurried attention of someone who sees what is actually there. Not what he wished were there, not what was convenient to see, what was there. "Dorothea gone," he said. "She's sending someone to see me," Clara said. "A widow on the Fetter Road. Credit trouble." He nodded. He was not surprised. He had understood who she was for long enough that nothing about her surprised him anymore, which was not indifference. It was the opposite of indifference. It was the specific attention of a man who has been paying close enough attention that he has arrived at understanding. "I'll start supper," she said. "I'll wash up," he said. These were ordinary words. The most ordinary words. The specific grammar of 2 people who have found their way to the daily, unglamorous, deeply necessary business of a shared life. She had had this once and lost it, and she had spent 7 months believing she would not have it again, and she was not sure yet what to do with the fact that she was wrong, that it was possible to lose everything and find something not instead, but alongside the loss growing in the same ground. She was learning. She was learning the specific geography of Wyatt's silences and the meaning of each of them. She was learning which problems he liked to solve out loud and which he needed to sit with alone first. She was learning that he was terrible at sleeping when the weather changed, and that he knew every star formation visible from the ranch's north pasture and would name them without prompting if she was standing beside him long enough. I was learning her too. She could see it in the small adjustments, the way he left the kitchen lamp at a height she preferred without being asked. The way he had started making coffee stronger on the days she had her most demanding accounts to review, the way he had stopped beginning sentences with, "I expect you probably," and started saying simply what he meant, because he had figured out that she preferred the direct version, and he was a man who adjusted to what was true. They were not a perfect pair. They were two people who had been broken in different places and set about the particular work of building something new from whatever was whole. The work was real. Some days it required more effort than others. Neither of them pretended otherwise. What they had was better than pretense. It was the thing under pretense, the actual foundation, solid and honest. The kind that holds when the storms come, because it was never built on anything that couldn't bear weight. Outside the window, the late September light came in warm and golden, and Clara Whitmore stood in the kitchen of the ranch she had chosen and listened to water running in the wash basin in the next room, and felt simply, without drama, without the need to name it into something larger, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The woman from the theater road arrived on a Thursday morning, which Clara had come to think of as the day things happened. Thursdays were the day Wyatt had first brought lumber, the day the Dawson brothers had testified, the day Judge Croft had issued his summons. Thursdays in Red Hollow had a particular weight to them now, as if the town itself had learned to use them for the work that mattered. Her name was Ruth Garland. She was 51 years old, broad-shouldered and red-handed from outdoor work, and she stood on the ranch porch with her hat in both hands and the specific expression of a woman who has rehearsed what she is about to say enough times that the rehearsal shows. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said. "Mrs. Webb said you might be willing to talk." "I am," Clara said. "Come in." She sat Ruth at the kitchen table and poured coffee and did not ask her to start until Ruth was ready, because she remembered what it felt like to need a moment before the words would come out the right way. Ruth took the moment. She wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at the table and then looked up. "My husband died 14 months ago," she said. "Fever. We had a small cattle operation on the Fetter Road, about 60 acres. It wasn't much, but it was paid for." She stopped. "The feed store won't extend me credit for the winter order. I have the cattle. I have the land. I have 3 years of payment history at that store before Henry died. But without his name on the account, they say the risk assessment is different." Clara looked at her. "Who told you that the risk assessment is different?" "The clerk. Young man, maybe 25. He said the store's policy under the new management was to review all accounts, and single women operating independent of a male guarantor were—" She stopped again. Her jaw tightened. "He used the word risk." Clara set her cup down carefully. She thought about Harlan Mercer's counter, and his spread hands, and the word condition used as a weapon. She thought about how power, when it falls, doesn't always fall completely. It leaves habits behind, and habits can run without anyone intending them to. The way a clock keeps ticking after the winder has left the room. "What's the size of the winter order?" Clara asked. Ruth told her. It was a reasonable amount for 60 acres of cattle operation. "And your cattle, what's the current head count, and what's your expected spring income from them?" Ruth told her that too. The numbers were solid. Not lavish, not precarious. Solid working frontier. Solid, the kind of numbers that represented a woman who understood exactly what she had and managed it without waste. "All right," Clara said. "Here's what we're going to do." Ruth looked at her with the cautious attention of someone who has been told things were going to be handled before and found the handling insufficient. "I'm going to write up a financial summary," Clara said. 1 page. Your assets, your income history, your projected spring returns, and your 3 years of account history at that store. Clear, simple, accurate. Then you're going to take it to the store manager, not the clerk, and you are going to set it on his desk and say that you expect your account reinstated by Friday. And if it isn't, you will be discussing the matter with Judge Croft's office, which is currently reviewing all commercial credit practices in Red Hollow County as part of its ongoing case proceedings. Ruth stared at her. "Is Croft's office actually reviewing commercial credit practices?" "Not specifically," Clara said. "But the case is open, the proceedings are ongoing, and every word of what you would say to that manager is accurate. The interpretation is his problem, not yours." Something shifted in Ruth Garland's face. It was a small shift, the kind that happens when a person who has been operating under one set of assumptions suddenly glimpses a different set, and the different set fits better. "You do that," Ruth said. "Write the summary." "I'll do it right now," Clara said. "It'll take 20 minutes. It took 18. Clara wrote it at the kitchen table while Ruth finished her coffee and she wrote it the way she wrote everything, exactly clearly, in the language that meant what it said, and couldn't be misread without deliberate effort. When she was done, she read it back to Ruth and made 2 small adjustments at Ruth's suggestions, because Ruth knew her own operation better than anyone, and the summary needed to reflect that. Ruth left with the paper folded in her coat pocket, and something different in her bearing. Not confidence exactly, because confidence was something you built over time, not something you got from a page. But the specific steadiness that comes from knowing you have the right language for the right room. Clara stood on the porch and watched her go, and she thought about Dorothea Webb saying people are talking about you differently, like you're someone, and she thought about all the women on all the roads, in all the counties, who were still being talked about. The way she had been talked about for 7 months, and she felt the particular urgency of that. The understanding that what she had built out of her own crisis was not complete when her own crisis was resolved. It was a starting point. She was still on the porch thinking about this, when Wyatt came in from the north pasture at midday, read her expression in the first 3 seconds and said, "Tell me." So she told him. Not just about Ruth, about the larger thing she'd been circling. He listened, the way he always listened, which was completely without interrupting, without beginning to formulate his response before she'd finished. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "You want to formalize it," he said. "I think so. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet. But the work I did for the case, the documentation, the financial analysis, that's work a lot of people in this county need done and can't access." She looked at him. "Women especially. Women who are exactly where I was a year ago and have nobody who speaks their language." "The language of numbers," Wyatt said. "The language of proof," she said. "There's a difference. Numbers are what you have. Proof is what you build from what you have. A lot of people have the numbers and don't know how to build the proof." He looked at her with the expression she had learned was him deciding something. "The ranch has a back room," he said. "It's been storage for 3 years. It could be an office." She looked at him. "You're offering me an office." "I'm telling you there's a room," he said. "What you put in it is your decision." She felt the warmth of it. The specific characteristic. Wyatt warmth of a thing offered without conditions and without the performance of generosity. Just the plain fact of it, take it or leave it, no cost either way. "I'll think about it," she said. "You've already decided," he said. She had. She just liked to give herself the courtesy of the thinking time. The back room became an office. It took 2 weekends. She and Ellis moved the storage to the barn. She brought her desk from the farmhouse. She organized the space with the systematic attention she gave to everything, and the result was a room that was entirely functional and entirely hers. A place where the work that mattered could be done properly. The first client she saw in the office was Ruth Garland, who came back on the Friday following her visit to report that the feed store manager had reinstated her account within 4 hours of her presenting the summary, and had done it with an apology that he clearly found uncomfortable to deliver, and that Ruth had received with the dignity of someone who knows an apology is just the beginning. The second client was a woman named May Chen, whose husband's mining claim was being disputed by a neighboring operation through a process that May suspected involved falsified survey records. Clara spent 3 hours with May's documents and found what May suspected. Not falsified, but selectively presented, which in practical terms amounted to the same thing. She wrote a formal response that May's husband could take to the mining office, and she charged a fair rate, and May paid it without hesitation. The third, fourth, and fifth clients came within the same week, referred through a chain of word that moved faster than Clara had anticipated, because word of a person who does competent, honest work moves quickly in communities that have been starved of it. By the time October arrived, the office had a regular schedule. Wyatt's sister arrived on the 3rd Thursday of October. Her name was Annie Callahan. She had kept the name, which Clara understood without needing to ask why, and she came off the stagecoach from Denver with 2 bags and the particular energy of a woman who has rebuilt herself once and is not afraid of the process. She was 43, lean and dark-haired like Wyatt, but with an expressiveness he didn't have where Wyatt's face was still and deep. Annie's was immediate, registering what she felt as she felt it. She looked at Clara for the first 5 seconds with the thorough, unself-conscious assessment of someone sizing up a situation that matters to her. And Clara looked back with the same directness, and Annie said, "He wrote that you were stubborn." "He mentioned stubborn, yes," Clara said. "He meant it as a compliment." "I know," Clara said. "I took it as one." Annie smiled fully quickly, the way some people smile when they find something genuinely good. "All right," she said. "I think we're going to get along." They did. Better than that, they got along in the particular way of two women who have both navigated substantial damage and come through it, not diminished, but reconfigured. Sharper, in some places, more deliberate in others, with a specific radar for what is real and what is performance, that made their conversation immediate and honest in a way that more comfortable lives don't always produce. On the second evening of her visit, Annie sat with Clara on the ranch porch after supper, while Wyatt was in the barn with Ellis, and she said the thing Clara had been wondering if she would say. "He's different," Annie said. "Since you." Clara looked at her. "Different how?" "Less." Annie thought about it. "He was very still before. Not the good kind of still. The kind that comes from deciding that nothing is worth moving for. He's still now, but it's the other kind. The kind that comes from being in the right place." She paused. "He wrote to me twice a month for 10 years, and the letters were always honest, but they were very empty, you know. Honest about facts, nothing about interior. The letter he wrote me about you was the first one in 10 years that had interior in it." Clara sat with that. She sat with what it meant that a man like Wyatt, for whom interior was the most private country, had written about her, with enough feeling that his sister could see it from Denver. "He's been good to me," Clara said quietly. "I know," Annie said. "He's been trying to be good to someone for years. He just needed someone who wouldn't mistake it for pity." She looked at Clara. "You didn't mistake it." "I was suspicious of it," Clara said honestly. "For longer than I should have been." "No," Annie said. "For exactly as long as was reasonable. That's different." She paused. "He told me about the store, what Mercer did." "He told you everything," Annie said. "Every part of it. He told me about the money he put on the counter, which I don't think he'd have told most people, because he doesn't make a story of the things he does. But he told me because—" She stopped, looked out at the dark. "Because he needed to tell someone what it meant to him to be in that room, to not walk past it." She was quiet for a moment. "He walked past so many things when I needed him. He wasn't here, and then when he got here, it was too late for me to use his help. I'd already gotten out myself. I think he's been carrying that." "He told me about you," Clara said. "Not everything, but enough." "He doesn't tell people about me," Annie said. "No, I think that's why it mattered that he did." They sat in the quiet of the early October dark, and somewhere in the barn, Ellis was saying something, and Wyatt was answering in that low, brief way of his, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch going through its evening rhythms came in around them, and Clara felt the particular fullness of a life that has people in it. Real people, present people, people who know you, rather than people who have decided about you. "I'm glad you're here," Clara said to Annie. "I mean the ranch. I mean here staying." "I might stay longer than the visit," Annie said in the careful way of someone testing language for something they've been thinking about. "I've been in Denver for 8 years. It's fine. But—" She paused. "Wyatt's out here. And now you're out here. And I think I've been alone long enough that the fine of Denver is starting to feel less fine." "There's room," Clara said. He said the same thing, almost those exact words. Annie smiled again. The Callahan response to everything. "There's room, yes or no?" "It works," Clara said. "It does." Annie agreed. November came in hard that year, the way the old-timers had predicted it would, with the cold arriving 2 weeks earlier than anyone, but the most pessimistic had expected. Clara's farmhouse held she had gone out to check it the week before the cold front came through, and the roof Wyatt had rebuilt held clean and solid, not a leak anywhere, and she had stood in the empty kitchen and felt a complicated gratitude for the fact that it was still there. Still hers. Still whole. The ranch held too, because Wyatt had spent September reinforcing the barn and the outbuildings with the systematic thoroughness of a man who has wintered in this country long enough to know what it requires and provides it without drama. By the time the first serious cold came through, everything that needed to be prepared was prepared. Clara's office continued through the cold. People came regardless of weather when the work was important, and the work was always important, because money and land and credit and the documents that governed them did not pause for weather. She saw 11 clients in November alone. She found errors, identified misrepresentations, wrote letters and summaries and formal responses that people took into rooms they'd previously felt unable to navigate, and she charged fairly and kept her own records immaculate because that was who she was. Ruth Garland's cattle made it through the first cold snap without incident. Ruth came to report this in person, which was not necessary and therefore meant something. "I told my neighbor about you," Ruth said. "Woman out on the east side of the Fetter Road. Her situation is more complicated than mine was. Land dispute that goes back 3 years. I told her you found things in Mei Chen's mining records that the mining office missed." "Send her in," Clara said. "She's not sure she can afford—" "Send her in," Clara said again. "We'll figure out the rate after I've seen what she's dealing with." Ruth looked at her for a moment, with the expression Clara was becoming familiar with people in the moment of realizing that what they are being offered is being offered without the hidden cost they learned to expect. "All right," Ruth said. "I'll send her Thursday." It was in the first week of December that Harland Mercer left Red Hollow. Clara heard about it, the way she heard everything from the town, now through a network that had reorganized itself around her, the way networks reorganize around useful things. He sold the store to a man from out of county who had no history in Red Hollow and no interest in maintaining Harland's particular methods. He sold his house. He left on a Tuesday morning with 2 wagons and no ceremony, and nobody from the town saw him off except the new store owner who was present for practical reasons. Clara heard this on Tuesday evening and sat with it for a while. She had thought she would feel more when this moment came. She had thought there would be something triumph or satisfaction, or the specific pleasure of a wrong being comprehensively righted. She felt some of those things. She felt them honestly without guilt about feeling them. But under them was something simpler and less dramatic, the feeling of a chapter actually closing. Not slamming shut with fanfare. Just reaching its last page and ending the way stories do when they are finished. She told Wyatt at supper. He listened. He said, "Good." Then he passed the bread and asked if she'd heard back from the woman on the east side of the Fetter Road yet. She had. That was who she was to him. Not a woman defined by her crisis. Not a widow. Not the target of something. A person with ongoing work and future plans, and a Thursday schedule that was currently full into January. She loved him for that. She had not said it yet in those words, and neither had he, but the thing between them had long since exceeded the language they'd been using for it, and she thought they both knew it and were simply taking their time arriving at the words because they were both people for whom words, when they came, needed to mean what they said. The words came on a Saturday evening in mid-December. They were at the kitchen table after supper, and Annie had gone to bed early because she'd been fighting a head cold for 3 days, and Ellis was in the bunkhouse, and the ranch was quiet, in the deep specific quiet of a winter night, when the cold has settled all the way down, and everything has stopped moving. Wyatt was looking at the map of the North Pasture, planning the spring fence expansion. Clara was reviewing the land dispute file for the Fetter Road case. They had been sitting in companionable silence for an hour. The particular silence, she had come to understand, was not the absence of connection, but the presence of comfort. He put the map down. She looked up. "I love you," he said. Flat and simple and certain, the way he said everything that was true. I want you to know that clearly, not implied by what I do not assumed from context. Clearly." She held it. She had been held before. She had been provided for, and lived alongside, and occasionally defended by a man who meant well and did his best. And she had loved Thomas Whitmore honestly, and grieved him honestly, and would carry him honestly for the rest of her life. But this was different from all of that, because Wyatt Callahan loved her the specific way that was most difficult to receive, and most worth having. He loved her by seeing her exactly as she was, without softening the sharp parts or enlarging the gentle parts, without the reshaping that people so often did to the people they loved in order to love them more easily. He loved the sharp parts and the gentle parts together because they were hers. "I love you," she said. "I have for a while. I wasn't ready to say it until I was sure I was saying it because it was true, and not because I was grateful, and now I'm sure." He nodded. That single settling nod. "Good," he said. "Good," she said. And they went back to their work. The map, the land file, because that was also who they were, and it was entirely right that this moment and the next ordinary moment should exist side by side, without the love diminishing the ordinary, or the ordinary diminishing the love. Christmas came and went with Annie's head cold resolved, and a dinner that Clara cooked and Annie helped with, and Wyatt and Ellis ate with the straightforward appreciation of people who work hard and regard a good meal as the serious thing it is. It was not a large celebration. It was a real one, which was better. January brought the woman from the east side of the Fetter Road, whose name was Patricia Ames, and whose land dispute turned out to be more complicated and more interesting than even Ruth had indicated. 3 years of conflicting survey claims, 2 deceased original claimants, and a paper trail that went back to a recording error in the county office in 1879 that nobody had caught because nobody had looked at the full history of the parcel from its original filing. Clara looked at it. She looked at it for 2 full days, cross-referencing every relevant document, building the timeline from the original filing forward. And at the end of 2 days, she had found something that made her sit back in her office chair and look at the ceiling for a moment. The error was in the county records, not in Patricia Ames's documents. The county recording office had transcribed the original survey boundary incorrectly in 1879, and everything that followed the dispute, the conflicting claims, the 3 years of legal back and forth, was built on that original error. Patricia Ames was not in a land dispute. She was the victim of a clerical error that the county was responsible for correcting. Clara brought this to Wyatt. He read through her documentation. He looked up. "Croft," he said. "Croft," she agreed. They went to Croft on a Thursday. Of course it was Thursday, and Clara set the documentation on his desk and walked him through the original 1879 recording error and its cascading consequences, and Croft looked at it with the expression of a man who has been a county judge for 19 years and has just discovered something in his county's records that was sitting there wrong for 2 decades. "How did you find this?" he said. "I started at the beginning," Clara said. "Most people start where the dispute started. I went back further." Croft looked at her over the papers. The 19-year skepticism had been reorganizing itself over the months into something she could only describe as professional regard. And today, it had gone one step further into something that was closer to awe, though Croft was not a man who would have used that word. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "have you ever considered working formally with this office?" She looked at him. "Formally?" "As a consultant, on case documentation and financial records." He paused. "I don't have authority to create a formal position without county approval, and that process takes time. But on a consulting basis with compensation, I can begin that today." She thought about it for exactly as long as she needed to think about it. "Yes," she said. She told Wyatt on this drive back to the ranch. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Croft's smart." "Yes," she said. "He saw what he had in front of him," Wyatt said, "and he did something about it." "People are capable of that," she said, "when they're paying attention." He looked at her briefly sideways, with the expression she loved most, because it was the expression nobody else probably ever saw on Wyatt Callahan's face. The one that was almost a smile, but more than a smile. The one that was his particular warmth arriving without disguise. "Some people," he said. "Some people," she agreed. The consulting work with Croft's office formalized in March, as he had said it would, with county approval, and a modest but fair compensation rate, and a designation in the county record that read Financial Records Consultant, which was an accurate description, and also Clara thought a beautiful one. She had spent her life with numbers and documents, and the particular intelligence required to see what they actually said, rather than what someone wanted them to say, and now that intelligence had a formal name in the public record of Red Hollow County. She was not the heavy-set widow anymore. She was not the woman from the store. She was not the problem that nobody wanted to be responsible for. She was Clara Whitmore, financial records consultant, bookkeeper partner, and in the opinion of 11 current clients and one county judge, one of the most competent people in the county. She had not become this. She had always been this. She had simply found the conditions in which it could be visible. Spring came to Red Hollow, with the particular recklessness of springs that follow hard winters, extravagant sudden green, arriving in a rush, as if making up for lost time. Clara's farmhouse garden, which she had been maintaining through the winter with occasional visits and stubbornness, came back full and then some. And she transplanted a section of it to the ranch garden, because there was more than enough, and because bringing living things from one place you loved to another was a way of carrying both places with you. On a Saturday morning, in April, a year and 8 months after she had first walked into Mercer's store, with 43 cents and a piece of paper listing exactly what she needed, Clara drove the buckboard into Red Hollow for a client meeting. She drove past Mercer's old store. The new owner had repainted it and changed the sign, and there was nothing of Harland left in it except the building itself, which had never been his to begin with, only his to occupy for a while. She drove past the courthouse where Croft's formal summons had been issued, and where she had spoken for 40 minutes to a full room. She drove past the post office where old Pete had stopped her and said, "My wife always liked you." She stopped in front of the feed store to settle an account matter for one of her clients. The clerk, a new one, not the young man who had used the word risk with Ruth Garland, that one had been let go in February, looked up when she came in and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I've got the Ames account paperwork ready for you." "Thank you," she said, and he handed it over, and she reviewed it at the counter with the same focused attention she had always had. And when she found one small discrepancy, she noted it, and he corrected it without argument, and she signed the corrected version, and thanked him, and left. She was at the buckboard when she heard her name. Mrs. Whitmore. She turned. 2 women she recognized from the church auxiliary women who had been in Mercer's store that morning, who had been examining yard goods in the corner while she stood at the counter. Women who had said nothing. The one who had spoken was maybe 60, with the careful self-possession of someone who knows exactly what they want to say and has checked it several times before saying it. Her companion stood slightly behind her. "We wanted to tell you," she said, "that we're sorry for that morning." She paused. "We've talked about it, between ourselves, for a long time. We should have said something then." Clara looked at them. She looked at the particular effort it had taken to say that the courage that was required, not heroic courage, but the everyday kind, the kind that means crossing a street and saying the thing you've owed someone for 18 months. "I know," Clara said. "Thank you for saying it now. You did something extraordinary," the woman said. "What you built, what you proved." "I did what I knew how to do," Clara said. "That's all anyone can do. The circumstances made it matter in a particular way." The woman nodded. Her companion nodded. They said good day, and Clara said good day, and they went their separate ways, and Clara stood for a moment at the buckboard and let the morning settle around her, the spring air, the sound of the town going about its business, the particular quality of a day that is ordinary and therefore exactly right. She was thinking about Wyatt. She was thinking about Annie at the ranch preparing a letter to a Denver friend about whether this country might suit her. She was thinking about Thursday's schedule. Patricia Ames in the morning, a new referral from May Chen in the afternoon, and whatever came in between that it would. She was thinking about the woman she had been 18 months ago, walking 3 miles in August heat with 43 cents. She thought about that woman with tenderness, because that woman had been doing everything right. She had been working, surviving, keeping records, keeping faith with her own competence, even when everyone around her was working hard to undermine it. That woman had not needed to be rescued. She had needed one person to stand in a room and say she asked for food, not humiliation, and let the arithmetic start over from there. Wyatt had given her that. Not a life she had built the life herself, the same way she had always built things carefully, from what was available checking her work. He had given her the starting conditions. The belief stated plainly and early that she was worth the honest accounting. Everything after that had been hers. She climbed up into the buckboard and took the reins and turned the horse toward the road home. Home. The ranch with Wyatt's steady presence, and Annie's laughter, and Ellis's wordless solid reliability, and the office in the back room where the work happened, and the kitchen where supper happened, and the porch where the long evenings happened, and the particular quality of a place that has been chosen deliberately by someone who knows exactly what she is choosing and has chosen it anyway. She thought about Ruth Garland's cattle making it through winter, about Patricia Ames's land and being formally corrected in the county record, about the woman who would come on Thursday and whatever her situation was, and the specific satisfaction of being able to sit across a table from that woman and say, "Here is what the numbers actually say. Here is what you actually have. Here is the language for the room you need to walk into." She thought about all of it on the drive back through the April morning, and she felt what she had been feeling for months now. Not the breathless, uncertain thing of early happiness, but the deeper settled bone-sure thing of a life that has found its own correct shape. The shape that was always there under all the months of being misdefined, waiting for the moment when the misdefinition stopped and the true accounting began. She was not too much. She had never been too much. She was Clara Whitmore. Exactly the right amount, exactly the right person, in exactly the right life. And she knew it the way you know things that are finished being questioned completely, without remainder with the whole of herself.